Hi, everyone. Today, what we'll do is continue to go through our last part of the course framework, Institutions in Social Life. And today, we'll turn our attention to the subtopic of race and how that ties into the institution of the family. So, just looking back quickly at our last class, when we looked at the institution of the economy with reference to the subtopic of play, basically what we did is look at how in the 50s, 60s, early 70s, we saw people participating more in community spaces, participating more in their community social institutions, such as the schools, such as religion, such as sports, such as government, and family life as a whole. Since then, during the mid 70s up until today, there's been a decrease in participation. And so, what Putnam did is basically, look at this decrease and how it ties into decreasing social capital. But while we also try to basically look at, yes, there's a decrease in participation, which leads to a decrease in social capital. How can we explain this? So we brought in the economy, kind of looking at it since the 1970s. Wages are stagnant. When we don't have as much money, we're not going to be able to go out as much, pay the fees, spend the money on the gas, so on and so on. We're shorter on time today as well. We work longer hours, we commute more, and with that we have less time to go out. And then basically we have higher levels of anxiety, higher levels of basically mental health issues. And with that, people will be less likely to go out, less likely to participate in public life, more likely to kind of stay at home and try to recharge their batteries and relax. So again, we can look at why basically then you saw more participation, why now we have less participation, but then kind of in the middle, we can look at the role of the economy kind of contributing to the lower levels of participation, thus the lower levels of social capital today. So, what I want to do for the DAO piece is kind of reorganize our course framework a little bit to look at how kind of culture can shape social psychology, and that can shape the institution of parenting, the parenting practices. So, just kind of keep in mind a lot of what the article gets into touches on what we talked about in the LaRoe book with reference to the influence of race on parenting style. Often, for white parents, race is not a variable that comes into play when it comes to how they parent and why they parent in certain ways. But for racial minority families, typically race is going to be an influential variable in terms of kind of how you think about your parenting, what you don't do as a parent. So here specifically, we're kind of looking at culture providing people these kind of what we call racialized meanings. So all these meanings are part of culture, and some of them are racialized. The meanings we attach to different racial categories. And when you're exposed to this culture, you learn and you internalize these racialized meanings. And just because you learn and you internalize them doesn't necessarily mean you believe them and you endorse them. But nevertheless, you kind of know those ideas, the stereotypes are out there because you've been exposed to them and you've learned them. And again, once you've learned something, you can use that knowledge to influence how you parent or how you don't parent. And that's what we're going to be looking at in the article for today. So, keep all this in mind with reference to the ninth in class assignment. So, basically, I try to organize the lecture today with reference to many of the key ideas in the ninth in class assignment and a multiple choice quiz with reference to the main ideas we'll be talking about here. So, overall, we're looking at what we call intersections. So, we can't look at all classes the same. People experience, being in the working class differently if you're a male or a female, if you're white or African American. And so we start to see that it's not kind of one variable that comes into play. You have to look at different intersections, how different variables intersect with one another to produce a reality in which somebody experiences life. So here we're looking at three main intersections: intersection of class, race, and gender. And specifically, we're looking at middle class families. We're looking at African American in terms of racial category. And then with respect to gender, we're looking at men and ideas of masculinity. So here we see that, the article talks about this in the introduction, how African American boys are stigmatized to higher degrees compared to other boys. So, compared to girls, boys are kind of defined. Boys are stereotyped in comparison to girls as being kind of more outgoing, more kind of aggressive. Um, but when you look at boys kind of among themselves, African American boys are kind of defined as being kind of hyper aggressive, kind of hyper outgoing. So that's kind of the idea here, is kind of recognizing that amongst boys, they're kind of defined differently as being kind of hyper this or hyper that. And then kind of even amongst African Americans, the girls are not kind of stigmatized or not defined to the same way. So African American boys compared to other boys are kind of seen as potentially more dangerous, kind of carry more negative stereotypes with them. And then what compared to African American girls, African American girls may be stereotyped more negatively compared to other girls, but not as badly compared to African American boys. So that's what the article kind of talks about. The sex of the kid does matter when it comes to how the parent parents. They're going to parent the African American kid who's a boy in one way, and they'll have different strategies with the African American girl. So, of these three variables, the race variable kind of outweighs class and gender. And this kind of ties into those stereotypes that are attached to African Americans, um, kind of being kind of the hyper aggressive, hyper violent compared to other racial categories. So that's why we'll say of the three, although all three are influential, race matters the most here. And so, like I mentioned, parents will use different strategies to parent sons. The parents are aware of the stereotypes attached to young African American boys and men. They don't believe them, but they know them, and they use these understandings to kind of shape their strategies. And they break the strategies into four types of experience. They're trying to, four types of management. One management type is experience, the other environment. Then you get into two more, managing image and managing emotions. So these are the strategies that we'll be talking about. So when managing experience, basically, the parents are trying to teach their sons different types of cultures, class-based cultures, race-based cultures, because they want to have their kids kind of recognize that you kind of live in one kind of middle-class cultural world, and that's only one aspect to the world. We want to expose you to, working classes. We want to expose you to, more African American, more racial minority cultures. So basically, you have kind of a full understanding of how life works, how life plays out. Because things may go one way in a middle class community, but when you enter, a different middle class community that's based upon a different culture, or a kind of lower class community, then things could go a little bit differently. So you don't want your kid to be kind of naive in these situations, but understand how things kind of operate outside your little bubble. And then also you want to teach your kid, in terms of managing experience, alternative forms of masculinity. Because as an African American male, often what you're exposed to in terms of the masculinity attached to African Americans is very narrowly defined in terms of kind of athletes and artists, kind of musicians and those who play sports. Otherwise, you don't get see a variety of kind of different um, versions of African American masculinity. There are CEOs out there. There are African American men who are educators, but you don't see those people kind of in the mainstream culture. So you want to expose your kids to those individuals to recognize that there are other ways to kind of do your male blackness than what you see over and over again in the media, on the TV. So, in addition to kind of managing the experience of the kid, kind of a general socialization, we can get into managing their environment. So, here you can break it down to two different things again. One thing is you want to keep your sons in familiar settings. And basically, here, where people know your kid, so the more you know somebody, the less you kind of see them through the variables of class, race, and gender. So if your kid is around a bunch of people who knows, you know, Ryan to be Ryan rather than Ryan as, the black kid, and then they're going to treat him as who he is rather than treat him as the black kid. So that's a much kind of safer environment compared to where he's unknown by people. Thus, he's kind of seen as the black kid and all the meanings attached to that, rather than for who he really is as a person. So another strategy to kind of manage the environment of the kid when you're parenting is to try to keep the sons indoors. So it's just easier to kind of monitor the kid, monitor the situation around the kid when it's when it's in an indoor kind of controlled environment compared to outdoor spaces where, relatively speaking, it's more informal control going on, and then it's kind of out of sight, out of mind. So again, there's things that they think about that sometimes, the white parent of a middle class boy, doesn't think about. The African American parent of a girl doesn't think about. So again, it kind of ties into all three variables: class, race, and the sex and gender of the kid. So finally, we can look at the two other management practices. I go into the overall strategies of parenting an African American boy. One is image. So basically, you want to try to make sure that the kid is not giving off the wrong impressions when he goes into public spaces. So one way you do this is you kind of do role playing scenarios. And so in these different situations, what would you do? How would you act? And again, you really don't see this going on with a parent of a white son who say, what are you going to do when somebody pulls you over? You really don't have that conversation, but you do see that with African American parents, especially when they're parenting a son. And so also you want to kind of manage behavior, clothing, language use. So again, you just don't want the kid to give off the wrong impression. You want the kid to kind of fit or fulfill any negative stereotypes. So you kind of make sure that the clothing isn't sending the wrong message, or the language the being used. You maybe want to avoid some types of slang being used, and overall behavior. So again, this is more going to be kind of in public spaces. You want your kid to be comfortable at home, among kind of friends and family, but when they go out to the public spaces at school, for example, at work, make sure that they're kind of presenting themselves in a way that doesn't bring any unwarranted potential danger, or doesn't, again, fulfill any negative stereotypes that would reinforce them overall, and kind of have people use them to define you rather than defining you for who you really are. So lastly, they manage emotions as well. So basically, try to have your kid really manage the negative emotions. And so, again, if you have people kind of judging the anger of a white kid versus an African American kid, and it's the same amount, so the degree of anger being displayed is the same. What studies show is still people rate the African American kid as being more angry uh, compared to the white kid. And so here again, the parents don't necessarily believe this stereotype, but they recognize that it does exist. And so what they do is try to again manage those negative emotions with the kid. So you know, make sure that you're biting your tongue. You may want to talk back, you may want to kind of say something, but try to hold those emotions in, suppress those negative emotions, and then you can find kind of other ways to kind of deal with them. So overall, again, each kind of piece of the puzzle, the kid being a male, a boy, the kid being from middle class, where you have to kind of navigate, certain cultures that you wouldn't otherwise, and the kid being African American, all pieces come together to create kind of this parenting experience. And it's going to be different once you change one of the variables, make it a daughter rather than a son, make it a white parent with a white son rather than African Americans. And again, everything changes, and thus the parenting strategies will change as well. So we'll leave that there for today, and we'll continue to go through the institutional part of the class when we meet again, and that will be focusing on the institution of education in the subtopic of gender.